period, therefore, a political system will contain some people who, if there were no barriers or costs in doing so, would be opposed to the conduct of the government. I think we can go further than that and say that even if there are barriers and costs to their doing so, some people would still oppose the government, but they may not choose or indeed be permitted to express or act on that opposition. But one cannot, after all, suppress private thoughts. The proposition is rather eloquently supported by Bernard Crick, who points out that to say there is opposition is in one sense simply to point to a vital condition of polity, so where Republican government exists, there is opposition. Though we cannot perhaps devise a catch-all definition, many have tried instead to describe its main usages. Barker has offered 6 possible definitions of opposition, whilst Philip Norton argues that opposition is in large part a description of a type of relationship rather than of any actor or set of actors within a political system. And he used the work of Anthony King to categorise 5 different types of opposition, many or indeed all of which could be in play at the same time. That makes for an awful lot of opposition to study and about which to attempt a working definition and consequent analysis. As Norton goes on to highlight, there's also an additional category of extra-parliamentary opposition to consider. The scope of these is wide indeed. The media, the courts, and the general public, either through referenda, petition, or street protest, will all fit inside that category. And those are merely the types of opposition that focus on opposing the government and its actions. The definition could be drawn wider still if we include opposition in the public sphere other than to national governments. From my own experience, I would highlight the constant and often highly emotive opposition that exists in local government, not between the parties, but in the area of planning policy. Here, residents are frequently in opposition to the plans of applicants, whether they be large corporations or their own neighbours. Similarly, every civil court case implies a relationship of opposition of one party to another. In fact, we might conclude that in most areas of human activity, there is some measure of opposition activity. With the inherent nature of opposition we noted earlier, the phenomenon is explicable in an almost Newtonian way. Wherever an action is taken, some measure of opposition is either present or conceivable. A toddler refusing to eat its dinner is engaging in opposition to their parent, just as surely as the leader of the opposition walking through the no lobby in Parliament is engaging in opposition to the government. With this huge breadth of different types of opposition, it does indeed seem impossible to attempt a comprehensive or useful definition of opposition in all its forms. And luckily for you, it's not my intention to try this evening. I've chosen instead the subject of loyal or constitutional opposition for my talk this evening, both because it's the most common and understood usage, but also because I suggest it is the development of that concept in a workable form that is a necessary condition for positive political reform in the Middle East. To start with, the issue of to what a constitutional opposition should be loyal needs further consideration. And that brings us back to the question I highlighted earlier. How do you criticise the King's government, yet not the King? That was the problem facing British constitutional and political theorists and practitioners during the 18th century, at a time when executive power continued to reside substantially, if not completely, within the person of the monarch, who also embodied the constitution. Arguing that opposition to the King was a legitimate and even necessary activity was therefore a courageous and difficult case to make. I'm sure I don't need to point out the possible parallels that can be drawn with political systems across the Middle East on that point, and why I think that question is so relevant. It was a question addressed directly by the oppositionist Henry St. John, later Viscount Bolingbroke, whose books and pamphlets, and most notably 1738's The Idea of a Patriot King, stand as seminal works in the theory of loyal opposition. He argued that a constant opposition was something that would lead not only to better government for all the people, but also protect the position of the King. His work is essential reading to understand the British concept of opposition as it's developed, and how the process might inform debates elsewhere. Bolingbroke began his tract by challenging the notion of a divine right of kings. That idea and its associated assumption that the king can do no wrong was an obvious obstacle to any attempt to introduce a critical element into discussions of executive action. First, he gives an account of human nature and society that makes it very clear that structures of government are human and not divine creations, and that whilst God has given humans the reason with which they build their societies, the constitutions of particular governments are like the bylaws of cities, and God has instituted neither monarchy, nor aristocracy, nor democracy, nor mixed government. This denial of the divinity of political institutions is significant, but he qualifies it with a defence of the rule of law, observing that though God has instituted no particular form of government amongst men, yet by the general laws of his kingdom he exacts our obedience to the laws of those communities to which each of us is attached by birth, or to which we may be attached by a subsequent and lawful engagement. Nevertheless, he establishes the premise that the form of government under which we live is not given specific sanction by God. It can thus be challenged, and challenge it he does. Turning his attention specifically to the divine right of kings, he argues that a king only has divine rights to govern when he is governing well, not when he is governing badly. A divine right to govern ill, he argued, is an absurdity and blasphemy. As his last description implies, he again turns to the Almighty to justify his viewpoint, stating that God has made us desire happiness. He has made our happiness dependent on society, and the happiness of society dependent on good or bad government. His intention, therefore, was that government should be good. For this reason, only a good king can derive his right to govern from God. This contention raises a variety of questions, not least how good and bad governance should be defined. But like the other writers we've considered, he's perhaps wise not to attempt a fully workable definition, beyond the general concept of liberty expressed elsewhere in his work. It's enough for him to assert the general principle and assume that it will be self-evident, presumably not least to God, into which category a particular monarch's rule would fit. However judged, the conditional nature of a king's divinity, as Bolingbroke saw it, allows him to draw a distinction between the position of monarch and the person filling it. For whilst the office of kings is then of right divine, as men they have no such right. This separation of the person of the monarch from the office that they fill is key to his later argument. And Barker noted that the existence of legal opposition involves some separation between the person and persons symbolising sovereignty and those exercising government. Bolingbroke extends this separation to the generality of all leaders who are due only legal reverence in the context of their role serving in government. Any reverence for them beyond that is preposterous and repugnant to common sense. Given that their position is national, not personal, which is something he illustrates with a suitably nautical metaphor. As well might we say that a ship is built and loaded and manned for the sake of any particular pilot, instead of acknowledging that the pilot is made for the sake of the ship. To put it another way, the ship of state is more important than its captain. Having made that point, he is at pains to stress that he is not arguing against the concept of monarchy itself, only that it should be a limited monarchy. Such a model in which monarchy is subject to checks and balances will, he argues, be a robust system for coping with whatever type of monarch occupies the throne. It will restrain effectively a bad prince without ever being felt as shackles by a good one. He considers that this would bring the constitution to a point, as he says, a point of perfection, but no king who is not in the true meaning of the word a patriot can govern Britain with ease, security, honour, dignity, or indeed with sufficient power and strength. But yet a king who is a patriot may govern with all the former, and besides them, with power as extended as the most absolute monarch can boast. This last point is important, as he's arguing not only that a system of limited government is necessary to ensure the liberties of the people, but also that when authority is used responsibly and for the public good, the monarch themselves benefits by possessing a power far more agreeable in the enjoyment as well as more effectual in the operation, as he puts it. It therefore has benefits for both sides of what is in effect a contract between prince and people, the prince to govern well and the people to honour and obey him. He then moves to the clearest enunciation of the concept. The provisions against a bad reign are hardest to obtain, he argues, when they are most necessary, that is, when the spirit of liberty begins to flag in a free people. But they are also necessary when the spirit of liberty is in full strength and, quote, a disposition to oppose all instances of maladministration and to resist all attempts on liberty is universal. His words stand as an effective argument for a permanent and constant opposition, not only in bad times, but also in good. Having made the case for opposition on the grounds of good government and liberty, he returns the advantages to the king of such a system, and in doing so introduces an unexpected ally, Machiavelli, noting that even he declares the affection of virtue to be useful to princes. The Italian, he argues, is so far on my side in the present question. The only difference between us I would have the virtue real, he requires no more than the appearance of it. His contention that genuine virtue is better than the appeared virtue is supported by the argument derived also from Machiavelli, that the supreme glory of a prince accrues to him who establishes good government and a free constitution, and that a prince ambitious of fame must wish to come into possession of a disordered and corrupted state, not to finish the wicked work that others have begun, and to complete the ruin, but to stop the progress of the first and to prevent the last. He thinks this not only the true way to fame, but to security and quiet, as the contrary leads not only to infamy, but to danger and to perpetual disquietude. This reference to the benefits of security and quiet over danger and disquiet echoes the words of another Italian writer, Sartori, whose work I'll come to in just a moment. And the reason I want to spend such a long time on Bolingbroke's tract was it seems to me that it has a particular relevance to what I've observed of governments in the Middle East. There we have many rulers who have an executive role in politics alongside being the embodiment of the state and of the constitution. Now that's had a profoundly stifling effect on the development of any meaningful opposition. And it's a fundamental problem that needs to be frankly addressed if political reform is to make progress in those countries where it is a factor. Bolingbroke gives us a convincing argument not just for how that step can be justified, but also for how it can benefit both the rulers and the ruled. In more modern discourse, our own pundit cites two ways in which political systems gain from the toleration of opposition to the established government. First, that for the government, criticism may lead to improvement of policies, and certainly provides those in power with a reaction to their activities. And for the government, the exposure of government actions and intentions provides a release to the public's frustrations with their rulers, while such exposure serves also to educate the public and keep them aware of the deficiencies of those in power. He also adds that another relevant factor of a democratic system, that the toleration of critics of those in power can provide the public with a choice of rulers, always assuming that the system provides for elections or for some other process to enable the government to be replaced by its critics. If we are to infer, and by now I think you'll agree I've done so quite blatantly, that the development of loyal opposition in the UK has some relevance for the Middle East, then we should perhaps return to the question of definitions and look a bit more closely at what that particular model involves. J.S. Punnett gives what I think is a particularly succinct and convincing definition of the institution and the loyal part of its name in the following terms in relation to the UK. Her Majesty's opposition is loyal in that it is concerned with achieving office within the established constitutional framework. The opposition is thus essentially non-revolutionary. It strives to gain office and the government seeks to retain office, but both are dedicated to the preservation of the basic features of the constitution. Thus the notion of a loyal opposition rests on the assumption that there are two levels of authority. Firstly, the basis of the established system, of the constitution, which is accepted both by those in power and those in opposition as the framework within which they will operate, and to which they will be loyal. And secondly, details within the system which are not accepted by those in opposition, and which are opposed by the means permitted by the agreed rules of the game. Her Majesty's loyal opposition, therefore, provides limited opposition, or opposition up to a point, in that it's concerned with criticising and seeking to change some aspects of the established system, while at the same time accepting its main features. The precise distinctions, however, between details and main features inevitably will be somewhat arbitrary, and there remains considerable scope for conflicting interpretations as to the exact limits of limited opposition. Giovanni Sartori adds to that definition and echoes some of the phrasing of Bolingbroke by arguing that a constitutional opposition presupposes quiet politics, belonging to what he calls a peaceful view of politics, not to a warlike approach in which the opposer is an enemy. In short, and in an intriguing turn of phrase, he notes constitutional opposition presupposes the domestication of politics and is understood as a form of collaboration. As he goes on to put it, opposition presupposes consent on fundamentals, that is, consent at the community and regime level. What the opposition opposes is a government, not the political system as such.